So next I want to come back to the album cover. The album cover of this 2009 album, Lights, right, which I've already drawn your attention to. As Matis describes himself, right, the title and the album cover, Light, reflect his growing interest in and deep study of Kabbalah. So he really began to study the Zohar and study Kabbalah, which is a form of Jewish mysticism, which is not totally different than the mysticism that we saw in Meister Eckhart or in a lot of other traditions around, but this deep sense of mystery or meaning called Kabbalah. Now, in a 2009 interview with Kim Lawton of Religion and Ethics News Weekly and PBS, Matisyahu talks about this theme of light. He says, well, in a nutshell, there's Kabbalah. The Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism, talks about the creation of the world, and the basic idea is that God, when God wanted to create the world, God withdrew light from the center of his being, right? And his light is like all being. Everything is consumed within God. Therefore, so in order for God to create the other, God had to sort of pull out his core being, pull out his light from the center, and then God created this sort of void, right? This Khora, Platonic ideas about the Khora, or space or emptiness, that we've explored in a slightly different way. It's not the same thing, but similar in Brahmagupta's notion of zero, right? That Akasha, Shunyam Shunyat Rina Akasha. Now, Akasha in Sanskrit, probably the simplest, most straightforward translation of it would just be space. But it also, Akasha, it means space in the sense of like all space, like all of existence, right? It can also mean the universe, like, and ultimate reality, Brahman, and everything. Akasha can mean space in the biggest sense of the word, right? But it just means, it means space. I think space in all the different ways that we take that to mean in English, and its vagaries, vagueness.
Vagueness?
Vagueness. Vagueness.
Vagueness?
Vagueness.
Vagueness?
Vagueness. Whatever. And all the words that we understand the word space to mean, I think we can also take it just Akasha literally to mean space, but it doesn't mean zero. It does not mean zero. It does not mean emptiness. 0 minus 0 is space, right? That paradox of signification. If we can get rid of all signifiers, all preconceived notions of self, world, and God, then we become one, right? We remove the distinctions between the divine and our very being. And Eckhart says we need to empty ourselves of everything, even the idea of place. We talked about with that emptiness, that zero, that space, right? That's Akasha, that emptiness, or this empty space within. And then the world basically exists inside of that empty space, right? So the universe exists inside of God's body, right? The light is surrounding it like on the outside. And he says, I find that to be really, I find it to resonate like very much with my experience of the world, and in any spirituality, basically, Eastern religion or Judaism or any tradition, there's a feeling of sort of having to get in touch with the empty, with the withdrawing of self. In Judaism, it's called bitul. It's sort of roughly translated as humility, but the ability almost like sacrifice, or to eliminate some aspect of yourself in order to make this space. And then the idea is not to get totally lost in that darkness, but to be rooted in it with the sense that there is above all of it, there is this surrounding light. Okay? So Kabbalah, pause here to discuss Kabbalah in a little bit more depth. So Kabbalah, as I've mentioned, is a Jewish mystic tradition that emerged in the 12th or 13th century in Europe. And the Zohar is a text from this tradition, which is a rich theological text from the 13th century. And one of the key aspects of this is what's known as the PaRDeS method of biblical exegesis. Exegesis means like taking the meaning out of the text, right? Not eisegesis, reading meaning into the text, but taking the meaning out of the biblical text itself. And there's a process for that called PaRDeS. PaRDeS is another acronym, right? The word PaRDeS means orchard, right? It's where we get the English word paradise. but it's an acronym. P stands for Peshat, or simple, right? So when you're reading the scriptures, it's just the most direct, most literal interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures. Remez, this hint, right? This sort of meaning, this sort of allegorical meaning, right? So like when we were studying the allegory of the cave, right? We read what's the literal meaning of the allegory, but then what does it mean? What's the allegorical? How does it speak to us today in a particular way, right? What's the bigger meaning? What's the truth of the story? What's the truth of the myth, right? Then Dirash. So this is listening to those authorities, those wise voices who's come before, right? Listening to the midrashic or the rabbinic meaning. So how have other wise people throughout time, right, interpreted this text? How have they understood it, right? Let's be informed of those perspectives. And then finally, Sod, right? The secret, the inner, the esoteric meaning that you can only get at, you can only enter that paradise, that true truth of the story, right, by going through these, by doing the work, right, of listening to those voices from the past and reading the text closely, allowing the text to anchor one's understanding of self, world, and God, right? Those first principles of philosophy that we talked about earlier in the course. So when we say midrash, we mean, the Talmud. The Talmud is about 6,200 pages long, divided into two parts, the Mishnah and the Gemara. Here I've included a painting by Karl Schleicher. I hope I pronounced that right from 1871. Controversy over the Talmud. I just love this painting, right? So these old guys are sitting around the Talmud, right? And they're pointing at the text and they're arguing over the text, right? They all have their different perspectives. The text is literally in the center, right? They're not exactly in a circle, but we've got that fourth wall there. But they're around the text, right? And the text is anchoring their discourse with one another. And it's fine to argue and to have differing perspectives. That's the whole point of the discourse, right? But the point is to wrestle with the text, to argue, to wrestle with the text and to wrestle with one another and argue just as Jacob did, right? When he became Israel, the one who wrestled with God. So in the Talmud, the Tanakh is at the center, right? The scripture is at the center here. And the Tanakh is always at the center. It's the anchor, right? But around it, right? This is how the Talmud is written. So that around it are all these different rabbinic interpretations. So many of which contradict one another. Some of them reference earlier versions, right? And say, oh, that guy's wrong, or he missed this, or whatever, right? But the point is not to say who's right. The point is to understand all of them, right? So that we can get to those deeper meanings of the text, allowing the text to anchor the discourse. But the discourse, the discussion, the study of the text is where that true meaning comes from. Right? That's only in that way can we get towards the truth of the text. So the point is that the text is not simply something to be interpreted, but it is something to be wrestled with, right? Israel. So in 2014, Matis released another album, one of my favorites, called the Akeda, right? Which means the binding. We've talked about this before in the previous lesson, right? As we learned earlier, the Akeda, the word Akeda refers to the binding of Isaac by Abraham, when Isaac almost killed his son because he heard this voice in his head saying to do it. Matisyahu in an interview describes the cover art this way. It describes the cover art, which was submitted by a fan. First of all, we can see from the cover art, right? I included it earlier when I was talking about Kabbalah and the creation story, right? That creating a space inside of God's body, because it's certainly reminiscent here too, or resonates with this image. But Matisyahu describes it this way. He says, he sees it as a man standing vulnerable and alone against the cosmic night, holding his heart up to God, and God doing the same to man, holding his heart, this burning world, in his hands, and offering it to us together, walking, bringing the sacrifice, making space for each other, listening and calling out, right? That listening and calling out is between God and humanity, God and creature, creator and creature, right? Bringing the sacrifice together, making space for one another. It's a beautiful, beautiful interpretation, very Kabbalistic, right, of this album cover. So next, I'd like you to listen. There is a great music video on this, but instead of watching the video, which has has its own layers of meaning to it. But I'd like you to just focus on the song and the lyrics, right? The music, it's a little bit haunting. It's a beautiful song, but just listen to it. As you listen, again, some number of things I just want you to take notice of. First, it begins with a whispered recitation in Hebrew of Psalm 37, 1 through 9. So in English, that passage is translated, "Do not compete with the wicked. Do not envy those who commit injustice, but trust in the Lord and do good. Then you will abide in the land and be nourished by faith. Do not let go of anger. Abandon rage. Do not compete with one who intends only to harm." So that's just the whispered prayer that begins in Hebrew, whispered at the beginning. But then notice in the lyrics of the song, what is being said about Moses and about the Mosaic covenant. There's just, every time I listen to this, every time I look at the lyrics again, I find new things that I hadn't noticed before. There's layers and layers of rich poetic meaning here in these lyrics. Notice also not just how he's talking about Moses, but also the reference to Jacob, right? He says, "I walk with a limp," right? Jacob, who became Israel after he wrestled with God and then, was struck lame by that person, angel, messenger, or God that's, with whom he wrestled and got that name Israel, the one who wrestled with God, and walks away with a limp. So notice that. Notice also what's being said in this video about, Joseph and his brothers. So after Matis left the Chabad Lubavitch and then eventually cut his hair and stopped wearing the kaput or yarmulke, and he got a lot of backlash, especially from a lot of his Jewish fans. Right? So there may be, certainly some of that is coming through in these lyrics about Joseph and the brothers and that sort of thing, which we looked at before. Certainly you should pause and listen to that song, Reservoir.